Welcome back. When we left off, we were in the first 5 books of the Bible called the Pentateuch, learning about Moses and the Israelites. God had sent 10 plagues on the Egyptians, and finally, Pharaoh had agreed to let the Israelites go. They've crossed the Red Sea, and they're headed for the Promised Land. Sunday school lady, what happens next?
So Moses leads the Israelites out of Egypt. They cross the Red Sea.
Oh, I remember this part. They walked through on dry land with the fishes just staring at them.
It doesn't say the fishes were staring at them in the Bible.
Well, it doesn't say they weren't.
Fellas, we don't know if the fish were staring at him or not. Anywho, Moses led them out of Egypt into a mountain called Sinai, somewhere in the Sinai Peninsula. We don't know for sure where it was. Some believe it was here. The rest of Exodus is about God making a covenant with Israel.
Covenant means promise.
We learned that already. Is this different than the covenant God made with Abraham?
It's very similar, but it's more specific. God promised Abraham that his descendants would be a great nation, have their own land, and bless the whole world. At Mount Sinai, God repeats these promises, but gives a whole lot more detail. He says he will be their God, and they will be his people. So this new nation will have God as their king.
As their king? Is he making a kingdom?
Actually, he is. Bring up the Bible, Magic Flannel Graph. One way to look at the Bible is as a book of promises, the old promise and the new promise. Another way to look at it is as 2 kingdoms. The Old Testament is the story of God making a physical kingdom, a place with buildings and a temple and a specific group of people. That kingdom was called Israel. The New Testament is the story of God making a spiritual kingdom, a kingdom we can't see or touch that everyone on earth can be a part of, a kingdom that completes God's rescue plan once and for all. So the Old Testament really doesn't make sense without the New Testament, and the New Testament really doesn't make sense without the Old Testament. We need the whole Bible.
Can we try to get through Exodus?
Oh, sorry. The rest of Exodus is about God starting the kingdom of Israel by telling them all how they should live in a world filled with sin. God gives them a whole lot of instructions.
What do you mean?
Well, there's instructions for how to run the kingdom, instructions for how to take over the Promised Land, even instructions for how to build a very special tent to be God's tent or tabernacle among the people. But most important instructions of all were called commandments, and they came in a special list of how many?
12, 9, 86.
Hike.
There were 10. 10 commandments.
Right, I've heard of those.
The most important commandment was the very first one. You shall have no other God but me. You see, the other nations around them thought lots of things were gods. They thought the sun was a god, so they'd pray to the sun. They thought the moon was a god, so they'd pray to the moon. They'd shape pieces of wood or gold or silver to look like people or animals, then say those were gods and pray to them. They'd even sacrifice their children to these fake gods.
That's terrible.
I'm disgusted.
So God made it clear to the Israelites that if they wanted to be his children, they couldn't have any other gods. God was their God, and they were his people.
So, how'd they do?
Did they get the hang of it?
Oh, they did all right. For about a month.
A month? Then what happened?
Well, God was giving all these instructions to Moses on top of Mount Sinai. Moses would climb up the mountain, and then God would come down as a cloud and talk to him. There were a lot of instructions, so Moses was up there once for 40 days. In the meantime, the folks at the bottom of the mountain decided Moses must be dead by now and figured they needed a new god. So they melted down their gold jewelry and shaped it into a baby cow. Then they said, "This is the God that brought us out of Egypt," and they prayed to the baby cow.
You've got to be kidding me.
They thought a baby cow made of gold saved them from Egypt? Are they loony?
They were acting just like the nations around them, not like God's people at all. They'd already broken their covenant with God. Moses knew that the price of sin was death, so he stood in front of God and begged for forgiveness, begged God to give them a second chance. and God did. So Numbers is a book about a big number of Israelites who wander around in the desert for 40 years instead of going to the promised land. Why were they stuck in the desert, Pastor Paul?
They were on time out. God saved them from Pharaoh's army and brought them across the Red Sea. And what did they do? Started complaining.
They didn't like the desert. It was too hot. They didn't have enough food, enough water.
So God brought them quail and manna to eat. He brought water right out of the rock. Then he showed them the promised land. Moses sent 12 spies into Canaan, the name of the land God promised them, to check it out. 2 of them said the land looked wonderful, filled with grapes and honey. The other 10 said it was nice, but...
They said the people there were too big, too strong. The Israelites would get walloped. They didn't believe they could overcome the giants, so they wouldn't go in.
They refused to go in. God brought them to the promised land, and they wouldn't go in.
So what did God do? He put them on time out. He said, I told you I was giving you this land. I would do the fighting for you. But you didn't believe me. You thought I, the God who made everything, couldn't give you that little piece of land. Since you wouldn't believe me, your kids can go into Canaan when they're old enough, but you can't. You're going to stay in the desert. So that's what the book of Numbers is, a 40-year timeout.
I see you're reading the Bible again.
Yep,
That usually means you're developing a big question.
yep.
Okay, what is it?
Lots of people died.
What do you mean?
In all those battles, the Israelites killed lots of people. Did God want them to die?
Oh my, that is a very tricky question. I guess it's time for Tricky Bits with Buck Denver.
Buck isn't here right now. Please leave a message after the beep. Beep!
And now it's time for Tricky Bits with Phil.
This is one of the trickiest bits in the whole Bible. When the Israelites entered the land of Canaan, there were already people living there, and they didn't want to leave. Most of those people eventually were killed by the Israelites. So why was it okay for the Israelites to take land from other people? And how could it possibly be okay for the Israelites to kill them to get it?
That's right. Killing and stealing are things we aren't supposed to do.
Well, first, taking the land. Whose land was it?
It belonged to the people who lived there.
Really? Who made the land? Who made the whole world? Who made the universe?
God did.
Oh, right.
So whose land was it?
It was God's.
Right. Say you have a toy. You let your friend play with your toy. But after a while, another friend asks if they can try the toy. So you take it back and let your other friend try it. Do you have the right to do that?
Sure you do. It's your toy.
Right. And if your friend refuses to give the toy back, who is wrong?
Your friend is. It wasn't his toy in the first place.
Exactly. If the entire universe belongs to God, God has every right to take a piece of land from one group of people and give it to another.
Well, that makes sense. But what about the killing?
Right, why did those people deserve to die?
This is the trickiest part of all. But it all comes down to sin. Who has sinned?
Adam and Eve started it, but then, well, everybody.
Right. In the New Testament, the Apostle Paul says we have all sinned and fall short of God's standard, God's glory. God has a standard for holiness, for how we should behave. Some of us can do better than others, and we feel pretty good about ourselves. But God's standard is so high, none of us can even come close.
So we're all sinners.
That's right. You, me, everyone. And what do we deserve when we sin against a holy God? What have we earned?
I'm thinking not a timeout, right?
That's right. Paul says the wages of sin, what we've earned when we sin against a holy God, is death.
So we all have earned death.
Yep. So the Egyptians who were killed by the plagues,
They got what they had earned.
and the Israelites who were swallowed by the ground,
They got what they had earned.
and the people of Canaan who stood against God, who said he couldn't have that land, who had worshipped other gods, who had even sacrificed their children to other gods.
They got what they had earned.
That's right. So the real question isn't why did the people of Canaan get what they deserve? The real question is, why haven't we?
Oh, that's a good question. If we've all sinned, and sin deserves death, why haven't we all gotten what we deserve?
Because God loves us. He launched his rescue plan to save as many as possible from the death we deserve. The people of Egypt who were holding the Israelites as slaves. The Israelites who told God his rescue plan was wrong. The people of Canaan who tried to stop God from giving the Israelites that land. They were all standing in the way of God's rescue plan. Thinking you can stop God's rescue plan is a little bit like thinking you can stop a freight train by standing in front of it. It's not very smart, and you're probably going to get hurt.
When the tribes of Israel took over the Promised Land, they didn't finish the job. They left lots of Canaanites, Hittites, Amorites, Perizzites, Hivites, and Jebusites living in the land.
They sound like diseases.
In a way, they were. They infected the tribes of Israel and led them away from God. An Israelite boy would see some cute Canaanite girl and want to marry her. Sure enough, pretty soon he was praying to the fake Canaanite gods instead of the one true God. And so began a great cycle.
What kind of cycle? A unicycle?
No, a great cycle of misery. A cycle of apostasy.
Pasta who?
Apostasy, a fancy word that means to walk away from what you believe, to abandon your beliefs.
That's right. And so the cycle began. First, the Israelites would forget all about God and start worshiping the fake gods of their neighbors. Then, God would take away his protection and his blessing from Israel, just like he'd promised back in Deuteronomy. A neighboring king would then come in and take over part of Israel and make their lives miserable. In misery, the children of Israel would call out to God for help, and God would answer. He would raise up a judge, a leader filled with God's Spirit and God's power, who would drive out their enemy and free the Israelites once again. The Israelites would celebrate how God had saved them, but then get lazy and go right back to worshiping the fake gods of their neighbors, and the whole thing would start over again.
They must have learned a little each time, right? So each time they went around, they weren't quite as bad?
Actually, it was just the opposite. Each time God raised up a judge to get him out of trouble, they'd forget him again and start doing stuff that was even worse.
That's right. By the end of the book of Judges, the Israelites had broken their covenant with God in every way imaginable. Some of the tribes of Israel were even killing each other. They were making idols, and some of the Levites, God's priests in Israel, were helping the other tribes worship the idols instead of God. The cycle of apostasy went down and down and down.
Oh, the cycle of apostasy brings Israel to misery. It's not a pretty sight to see they go down and down again. They do what's right in their own eyes, and much too late they realize, and then to God apologize and come around again. Now they're good and now they're bad. First they're happy, then they're sad, and now they need their heavenly dad to bail them out again. So do not do what Israel did. Be a bright and faithful kid, and you'll be happy that you did. You won't go down again.